Why I feel that it may be one of the final pieces of our puzzle, but that it's part of a larger issue, that it isn't the cause in and of itself. So, but I think that was a good question, and so I did want to address it. Now, sometimes you see what I was saying about very high gut pH, and we know now that's because Helicobacter plays games with the system and increases the level of urease and neutralizes the gut acid. This is what you're looking for when you're worried about ketosis. Remember I talked about ketosis a lot, how it can cause psychosis, how it can imbalance the mitochondria, how you may want to adjust your supplementation, look about changing your diet. This is an indicator right here of ketosis. And then, again, an indicator that we need to be adding carnitine. Looking at your arginine levels, but this is going to be a UAA that isn't really going to be that helpful in terms of arginine. It might be supportive in light of everything else, but in and of itself, if this was the only test you ran, you might not be so certain there was an issue. Yeah, April. Oh, yeah, certainly. Yeah, we can go back to that one because I think it's really an important one. And we're looking at beta-hydroxybutyric acid. High levels of that, because it's a ketone, is a strong indicator for ketosis. Here on the UEE, again, looking at manganese levels as another indicator. And again, my concerns for a while now that if we've got very low manganese levels, do we have an issue with Helicobacter? In this case, yes, it's looking like with Suberic we need some carnitine, but not that significant. The pH is low, but we're seeing blood in the stool. And again, blood in the stool makes me think Helicobacter or hemolytic E. coli, or in some cases Salmonella. And in this case, we were able to get a positive test, but again, a negative test isn't always meaningful. I do feel that a positive test is meaningful. Oftentimes, once we get Helicobacter in better balance, the carnitine levels will get in better balance. So again, seeing low manganese on a UEE, looking at the need for carnitine, high Suberic, it's all the way to the right, and also high DHPPA, dealing with Helicobacter infection that we're seeing, and then being able to pull that Suberic level down. Negative tests aren't always conclusive, and you want to be looking at other indicators. So again, look at the low manganese, run other tests. And we're also seeing this on adults on the program, and sometimes we're not seeing as many indicators. So adults that may be having issues with Helicobacter, where we have very high DHPPA, but looking at this UTM, you really wouldn't be overly concerned that Helicobacter was a problem. And again, why we want to look at a composite of tests. Sky-high DHPPA, you're sitting at 35, you want to be running a battery of tests and look at what else is going on. And sure enough, we're seeing high-level Helicobacter. In that individual, the manganese wasn't an indicator. And so again, why I went to this comprehensive testing. Seeing Helicobacter as an issue, we can see that arginine level that doesn't seem to be tracking with the rest of the amino acids, seeing a need for carnitine with the high Suberic. Sometimes you'll see this, and I know we've had this question on the discussion group. Why is the pH coming out high on one test and low on the other test? And in those situations, you want to be thinking Helicobacter, because we know that Helicobacter can play with the gut pH, and that low pH may have attracted it in the first place. I'm looking at the low manganese levels. You had a question? Not always, but I certainly think that I would use the breath test to try to follow up and see if you're making progress, because the breath test is going to be a lot less expensive than following up with MAP tests to make sure you're getting in balance. I say not always because one of the young girls I'm working with recently who had a severe issue with ketosis, it wasn't picked up in the breath test. Nancy, do you know if the individual, the 21-year-old who had the ketosis, did it turn up in a breath test or no? It did. Okay. So at least in some instances, it's tracking really nicely. Okay, so repeat testing will generally get it to show up, and we're working now on trying to get some more sophisticated testing so that we can more reproducibly pick H. pylori up on a PCR test. And again, I'm showing you a lot of these, number one, to give your brains a little bit of a break before we go to the next heavy-duty PowerPoint, but also just to reinforce the fact that what you want to be looking at on these tests and that we see it reproducibly time and time again. And it's almost rare at this point that you're going to look through an entire file and not see a number of these indicators and indicators that oftentimes are showing up as H. pylori. This was the individual I talked about earlier with the bruising and bleeding, and we were seeing a need in terms of carnitine, but looking at the low manganese levels now that we know we have an issue. UAA wasn't as revealing. Yes, we were seeing some bismuth, but not one of those where you're seeing it totally across the page. And then when we finally measured it, very, very high levels of Helicobacter. This was one of the highest levels we've seen. And she's actually chosen to go the antibiotic route to try to treat it, and I'm not sure that's been that successful. So again, why you want a comprehensive program review. Some tests can look totally imbalanced even if Helicobacter is an issue. This, yeah, you would say if you looked at it that you want to add some carnitine, but it's not so out of balance that you would be alerted. And certainly here, the essential minerals are looking actually quite lovely on this hair metal test. And even if we look at bismuth, we're not excreting very much here. Cadmium, definitely an indicator. That should have been a red flag, and sure enough, we're seeing Helicobacter. As I mentioned earlier, there are two intermediates in the Krebs cycle that if those are the only two that are high and the other intermediates in the Krebs cycle are low, there's a biochemical reason why that may be an indicator for a Helicobacter. And in this case, sure enough, it was in a very high level of Helicobacter. Be suspicious anytime the gut pH is high. So carnitine wasn't looking too bad, but we're sitting up around 7, and sure enough, Helicobacter is an issue. Watch for a history of high subaric combined with cadmium excretion. And so we've got high subaric, we've got high HPPA, history of high subaric, dumping cadmium, manganese low but not horrendous, and sure enough we've got Helicobacter as an issue. And even if we don't have a GI function yet, be suspicious anytime you see a state of ketosis, especially if we've got low manganese, and again, if you've got very high beta-hydroxybutyric acid, this is what we're worried about in terms of a state of ketosis, and this is a situation where I would definitely run tests to look for Helicobacter. Even if we have nothing that's striking other than a high gut pH, that may be an indicator of Helicobacter and why you want to run comprehensive tests. I certainly wouldn't think this was an indicator. Manganese isn't doing too badly. Cadmium's being excreted, and I did have some suspicions at that point, but I wasn't overwhelmingly concerned. Looking at the higher gut pH, and sure enough, Helicobacter was an issue. And then conversely, same deal, only low gut pH. And so we're not seeing anything in terms of low manganese here. The carnitine, need for carnitine isn't too much, although there were fat digestion issues. We're not seeing cadmium across the board, but we're seeing a very low gut pH in this case, and sure enough, we're seeing Helicobacter. You want to look at neurotransmitter tests too. It's not just about tryptamine, because remember we said Helicobacter can throw off that balance between norepinephrine and epinephrine, also affect the 5-hydroxy-indole acetic acid levels and the serotonin levels. And so you want to be looking at those tests also. And in this case, a strong indicator with the high subaric that Helicobacter may be an issue. Again, in this case, arginine standing out a little more compared with the other amino acids. Manganese not being a strong indicator, and again, seeing Helicobacter. And so you see there's a certain pattern of indicators we're looking at, but you want to look at them as a whole. If you're only looking at one or two, you may miss what's going on, which is why I felt so strongly we needed to go to the comprehensive testing. And again, you know, not looking too bad. The manganese is a little bit low. The UAA is looking really quite nice. Yes, you could stand a little extra carnitine, and I had some concerns about H. pylori. But based on that UAA alone, I never would have thought it was an issue. You sometimes can see H. pylori even if we're not seeing an ideal CSA, and this is far from an ideal CSA. Indications from the cadmium, indication from the arginine, indication from the bismuth, taking a look at the manganese, and in this case, sometimes you'll see dumping before it drops all the way down, and we're seeing the dumping. Low gut pH, and we're seeing the Helicobacter. And again, test on a regular basis. It can show up again. Just reiterating the difficulty to eradicate this, even if you're using conventional methods. So even if things are looking better, over time it can come back. And so we want to cycle on and off. And I told you that I would show you, I think this is the last one of these slides before we switch to the next PowerPoint. Very low gut pH for this individual. I was concerned about issues with H. pylori for quite some time. They were trying to rule out whatever was going on with glaucoma, and I had sent her the article about H. pylori and glaucoma, seeing some indications in terms of the arginine, some indicators with the carnitine, but not that strong. And sure enough, we're seeing a very, very high level of Helicobacter, you know, in a very young person who someone that age shouldn't be having problems with glaucoma. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to shift over and think about why we're seeing so many positive for H. pylori compared to what is reported. Because if you look at the reports, we should be seeing this in older adults in third world countries. And so again, you know, following up with, sometimes we don't see a lot of indicators, yet we're seeing something going on in most of the tests that we're looking at that's giving us almost, you know, 95% of the tests we're looking at in files, we're seeing something along these lines. I need help. So what we're going to shift over to now is another one of those PowerPoints where we have a lot of third-party peer-reviewed literature and articles to support what I'm going to be telling you. And I'll always try to do that when I'm bringing new concepts so that you can see what drew me to these conclusions, what the support is for these conclusions, and then we'll end with some lithium data so that your brains can get a rest again. The one we want is the CF. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we just need to do the full screen thing. Okay. Yes? I would say work with your doctor, because I don't want to be prescribing or just, you know, giving exact. I usually start at low levels of any of them and gradually increase to what's tolerated, but work with your doctor on it and then do follow-up testing, and also judge it based on how your child's reacting, because everyone's an individual. Some of the kids on this program are using really high doses of a number of those supplements, and some of them are using literally sprinkles and just a couple of drops. And also, I know Kimmy and I were talking about over time, as you make progress, they're able to tolerate a whole lot more of it too. Okay? So why would more than 50% of the kids be having this as an issue? And actually, if you think about it, we should be seeing this at a very low level in children, and it should only be an issue in older adults under other conditions. One of the reasons may be lack of bile. Bile inhibits the growth of Helicobacter. Many of the kids have pancreatic issues, some of those secondary to rubella issues. A number of the kids have ACAT issues, a lot of them having issues with fat digestion in the body. The other could be acidity. Lack of B12 and methylation cycle mutations may be creating more stomach acid initially to try to get absorption of B12, because your body uses your stomach acid along with intrinsic factor for B12 absorption. And if you're not bringing in enough B12, the acidity may be higher, and that's attracting the Helicobacter in the first place in order to get it to bind. Excess mucus, so that the Helicobacter has that mucus layer to hide in. And we'll get into some of this in a few moments. But the gene, the CFTR gene that causes cystic fibrosis, can be impacted and impaired by high cadmium and also lack of methylation. And lack of methylation can increase viral loads, which increases cadmium, which then further impairs the cystic fibrosis transport gene. And so that it may be indirectly we have excess mucus problems because of the cadmium and decreased methylation. Pancreatic weakness, decreased bile, cadmium's effect on the pancreas, as well as chronic rubella, and decreased methylation, and we'll see some articles where a direct relationship is present between the MTHFR C677T mutation and Helicobacter infection. And so what we'll go over in this PowerPoint is the connection that I believe that there is between CFTR and what we're seeing, the fact that those who do have cystic fibrosis have a much higher level of Helicobacter infection. The data, our data, I was so concerned that I developed a 30 SNP panel just for cystic fibrosis mutations. We absorbed the cost of it, developed a 30 SNP panel, and then used samples from 50 of the most severe individuals on the program to run them looking for SNPs to see if this was yet another SNP that was an issue. And actually 100% of them turned out negative. No one had the SNPs. And so then we ran additional SNPs because I was so sure we would see something. And none of those showed the SNPs either. And then on further looking through the literature, come to find out that this gene is controlled by methylation, so no surprise, impaired. And then this gene is also regulated or downregulated by cadmium. And so I believe that we don't have specific mutations here, but essentially functional mutations, that between cadmium and decreased methylation we have a problem. Yet, because of this functional mutation, we're seeing a lot of similarities in what goes on with the cystic fibrosis mutation and what we see in autism. And Rosemary Waring's work with decreased levels of thiocyanate, imbalances in glutathione levels, cadmium in CF, methylation in CF, and lo and behold, CF and the imbalances of polyamines that are almost identical to what we're seeing with Helicobacter. And so I found this a very interesting article because they were comparing autism and cystic fibrosis and looking at the impact on the family, and their conclusion was that autism and cystic fibrosis are different in many ways. And actually, I would beg to differ. I think there's a number of shared characteristics, and while we don't have CFTR mutations per se, that there may be a functional disability that we're dealing with for many of the kids. So what is cystic fibrosis? It's a mutation in the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator. And what that does is it helps to regulate the transport of certain nutrients in and out of the cell. And it's important in creating digestive juices, but more importantly with respect to Helicobacter in the talk today, we're more concerned about the role it has in mucus because the Helicobacter is hiding in that mucus layer. In addition, certain of the lesser known mutations in this gene play roles with chloride, iodide, but thiocyanate levels and their transport. And so when this gene isn't working properly, thiocyanate can get trapped inside the cells and outside in the skin, and it can't play a role in immune defense. And so what happens? Initially, we could have problems with staph, then we go to problems with Haemophilus, and then we start to see problems with Pseudomonas. And my guess is that almost every one of you have seen problems with at least 2 out of 3 of these organisms on your CSAs. I know that I'm seeing problems with all 3 of those organisms virtually in every file that I see. And so I think that the imbalances that may be occurring so that we don't have appropriate levels of thiocyanate that play a role in cystic fibrosis may also be playing a role in autism. And so cystic fibrosis, there's a large number of mutations, and they're also related to where you're located. And so some of these mutations are more prevalent in different areas of the world than others. And then there are particular mutations that don't really affect the role of the gene with respect to the lungs, but affect the pancreas. And because the pancreas is so involved with bile and the pancreas is involved with rubella, I had assumed, I really did, I went into this assuming we were going to see that mutation in some of the kids that we looked at. And again, you know, from this data that it affects the pancreas more so than it affects the lungs. So I figured for certain this was going to be yet one more piece of the puzzle. Well, we ran a screen, we got all of the SNPs characterized, we looked at them, and no one had any of those mutations, not the one I thought and not any of the other ones. So I persevered, and I had the lab come up with tests for additional SNPs. And the first part are now the standard controls, and the controls are working beautifully, okay? So that we have various mutations that we can pick up for all of the controls. But when we look at the samples from the individuals on this program, the only 2 cases where we're getting positives are one individual that I already knew when we began had a single carrier status, and another individual on the program that we knew was positive for cystic fibrosis. So in spite of all of these SNPs and all of these SNPs, the good news is no one has a cystic fibrosis carrier status. But it still left me at a point of why do I believe so strongly that this thick mucus, that the thiocyanate, that the glutathione levels, all of these things that are roles in cystic fibrosis are playing a role with autism, and what is the reason behind the connection? And cystic fibrosis and Helicobacter are certainly tied together tightly like we seem to be seeing in autism. And I mentioned earlier, Helicobacter impairs vitamin C levels, and vitamin C levels are one of the controllers of this gene. And so we end up in yet another one of these catch-22s that we see in autism. Helicobacter may be more attracted to the system if the mucus layer is thick because of imbalances in this gene, which then depletes vitamin C and then further affects the ability of this gene to function. And glutathione is such a hot topic for autism, but glutathione is as big a deal, if not a bigger deal, when it comes to cystic fibrosis. And it directly is correlated with regulation of glutathione levels. Okay, so that when we look systemic deficiency of glutathione in cystic fibrosis, and there are some studies that feel that cystic fibrosis is actually a condition of reduced glutathione, and that is the root of the problem. And secondary to this glutathione, reduced glutathione, are problems in the mucus layer. And so we do want glutathione support. We don't want to go overboard with support. But this relationship between glutathione levels in autism, glutathione levels in cystic fibrosis, and imbalances in a mucus layer that may give Helicobacter somewhere to hide. And again, rethinking cystic fibrosis, this particular group feels that glutathione deficiency is the primary cause of cystic fibrosis. And depletion of glutathione playing a role in mucin secretion, looking at levels of NF-kappa B, and eventually creating a situation where Pseudomonas is more of an issue. And I'd be willing to bet almost every one of you has seen issues with Pseudomonas at one point or another on CSA tests. And again, getting back to imbalances in regulation related to glutathione. And if we look at Rosemary Waring's work with sulfur metabolism and autism, autistic children have more problems, higher levels of certain sulfur groups, but reduced levels of thiocyanate, just as we're seeing reduced levels of thiocyanate with cystic fibrosis. And so from her paper, if we look at thiocyanate levels, controls are at 44 and autistic individuals down at 6. So a severe deficiency in thiocyanate. And that's why we've gone to using low doses of that KIB 500 as part of the Helicobacter program. I'm not thrilled with it as a supplement. It's difficult to use. You have to use it all at once. It's expensive. We're looking into finding another source or a better source for this that we can use the way we like to do, low doses and not as expensive. The Biotine mouthwash and toothpaste actually has low levels of thiocyanate in it, but I don't know if it's going to be enough to supplement and make a difference. And just looking at this pathway, and again, you don't have to know it, you don't need to memorize it, but later on, if you want to go back and say, where was that thiocyanate working and why does Dr. Amy care about it? This is the pathway we're looking at, and this is where it sits. And just keeping in mind that when you're adding anything as a source of thiocyanate, you also want to be using hydroxy B12. Hydroxy B12 helps to remove excess cyanide from the body. And that is the treatment actually for cyanide poisoning. And so you want to be using hydroxy B12 when you're supporting with any form of thiocyanate. And just as I showed you Rosemary Waring's work with reduced thiocyanate in autism, reduced thiocyanate in the lungs of cystic fibrosis, and we're just going to see a number of slides saying the same thing different ways, but supporting the fact that I'm not just saying this, but it's out there in the literature in multiple forms. Also, this recurring theme of pancreatic issues when we have reduction of the cystic fibrosis transmembrane gene. And again, the role that thiocyanate is playing in a number of these conditions. And just how low thiocyanate, again, is critical in terms of cystic fibrosis and the role that the compounds play in killing organisms in the body. So the thiocyanate playing a role in addressing staph and addressing Pseudomonas. And just looking at the killing curves, of these organisms in the presence or absence of thiocyanate. And looking here now, why it might be even more important to address H. pylori as a first step to get the gut in better balance. Because if H. pylori is affecting the function of this gene by virtue of the fact that it hangs on to cadmium, and we'll see that in a moment, and because of methylation issues, and so we end up with lower thiocyanate, we may not be able to get some of that staph and Pseudomonas imbalance until we've already started to address H. pylori as a first step and as an issue. And just more pictures just showing you the pathway, looking at the role this plays so critically in helping to kill bacterial loads. I told you that we would get into this then, cystic fibrosis and altered polyamine levels. And the alteration in polyamine levels, that balance between putrescine, spermine, and spermidine that you're seeing in cystic fibrosis is the same imbalance that we see with Helicobacter infection. And so some of the similarities here and why we want to look at it. So why would CFTR function be compromised in autism if we don't have a specific SNP that's creating the problem, if we don't have a mutation? And between now and the October conference, what I probably will do to make sure that we've dotted every I and crossed every T is take some samples and actually have the entire CFTR gene sequenced for some of the more severe individuals on the program, just to make sure that there are absolutely no CFTR SNPs that could be an issue that we've missed. But at this point, I feel that more likely, the fact that we have high levels of cadmium, decreased methylation, viral issues which then enhance the cadmium problem, H. pylori, reduced glutathione, that all of these are playing a role even though we don't have a CFTR mutation per se. Because cadmium regulates the level of CFTR. So if we have Helicobacter, and we've got high levels of cadmium, and cadmium is impairing the function of this gene, then we don't need a mutation for this to be a problem. And if this gene isn't functioning properly, then we can have thicker mucus that the Helicobacter can hide in. And so we create this cyclic problem where one is feeding on the other. And Helicobacter actually has proteins designed to bind and transport cadmium. And this fits with what we were seeing earlier clinically with the dumping of cadmium when we've got Helicobacter issues. And so what you're looking here, it's a gel, and you're looking at this point in the presence of cadmium, there is actually a very specific transport protein that Helicobacter has specifically for cadmium. And we'll go back a moment. And this is specific because when it's cross-checked against nickel, and nickel also can play a role with some of the other enzymes, but nickel does not induce this binding protein the way cadmium does. So it's a specific interaction between Helicobacter and cadmium. And other bacteria are known to interact with cadmium and hang on to cadmium. Nickel can play a role with that urease we talked about before for neutralizing stomach acid, but it is not binding the cadmium. And originally, Helicobacter used to be known as Campylobacter. And I mention that because sometimes on the GI function test, Helicobacter will not show up, but Campylobacter will show up. And it's possible that the binding probes that they're using to pick up Helicobacter is actually picking up Campylobacter in those cases. And I've had at least one individual that first showed positive for Campylobacter, and on repeated testing it then converted to positive for Helicobacter. And Campylobacter has a strong relationship with cadmium also, directly binding with cadmium, especially under stress. Also, cadmium itself can create problems with metallothionein. And so some of the work from Bill Walsh years ago about metallothionein levels, and those may be thrown off by the cadmium. Now, this gene, the CFTR, is also regulated tightly by methylation. And so even if we don't have Helicobacter as an issue, and even if we didn't have high cadmium as an issue, if we've got methylation cycle mutations, we're much more likely to have a problem because this gene is relying on methylation for activity. And I spoke about methylation at length yesterday in the doctor's workshop, and I will talk about it at length again in October at the conference in Los Angeles. But suffice to say that methylation of specific sites at CFTR regulates this gene. And so if we don't have appropriate methylation, it will not be regulated properly. Another point where CF and autism are hitting a same point are toll receptors. And those are very related to immune regulation. And toll-like receptors, toll-2 in particular, is a problem in CF. And we can see the difference in terms of non-CF and CF, toll receptor expression, and this is regulated by methylation. So differences in methylation affecting toll receptors in the CF population. And now we get to autism, and sure enough, imbalances in toll receptors. And it's actually the same toll receptor that we're looking at, toll-2, that's an imbalance in autism that we're seeing in CF. And so again, a lot of similarities. We're not believing that it's due to a CF mutation carrier status per se, but reduced activity of that CFTR due to cadmium, due to Helicobacter, due to lack of methylation. What am I wanting? Again, methylation here playing a role in terms of the CF gene, DNA methylation controlling it, specifically at CPG sites. And you can actually see here sites that are meant to be methylated and not methylated, controlling again this gene and its function. And so it makes a lot of sense if you've got methylation cycle problems, if you're not filling that methylation cycle appropriately, we're going to have issues regulating this gene. And showing it yet again another way, the methylation stage of this CPG site in the CFTR, and the promoter, which is what turns it on, being regulated by methylation. Methylation dependent, methylation independent. So again, methylation cycle imbalances may be a sufficient condition for the CFTR to not function properly. So taken together, what are we seeing? The impact of decreased methylation on CFTR directly, as well as decreased methylation on H. pylori, increased cadmium that further decreases CFTR function, can create a scenario where we have reduced CFTR function in spite of the fact that we're not seeing specific mutations. And so what we need to think about is the importance of methylation, how it relates to H. pylori. We're probably not going to get to methylation in greater detail today. And so what I would suggest on that topic is taking a look at DVDs from prior conferences, sign on to the chat group, take advantage of the book and the workbook, come to the conference in October, and the PowerPoints that I uploaded for the Autism One conference this time are not the ones that I'm presenting right now. They're all about the background of methylation, so everyone would have that background. And now, since they're taping this information will be up there for you also. The MTHFR C677T mutation that a lot of the individuals have is part of the methylation panel, directly related to an association with Helicobacter. And so here we have a direct tie-in between lack of methylation and a predisposition to Helicobacter. And so where that mutation sits, to remind you, is right here in the cycle. And so what this paper is showing us is that DNA methylation definitely is related directly to H. pylori and a predisposing factor for imbalances with respect to H. pylori. Secondary long-term effects of Helicobacter is gastric carcinoma, and that is tied together with lack of methylation. That methylation of the promoter, especially in these CPG islands, is playing a strong role with respect to Helicobacter, and that the frequency or the level of some of these methylations correlate with H. pylori infection. And so a tight tie-in between methylation cycle mutations and H. pylori infection. And then additional articles and references on the tie-in between methylation and H. pylori incidence, methylation and H. pylori, and again, tie-ins between H. pylori and methylation issues. Did you have a question? We haven't looked at that statistically yet because this is a newer part of the program. But what I would say is, with the supports that we're using, we are seeing improvements across the board. So I have not yet had an individual who's using the supports we've got for it, needing to go to antibiotics to address it, other than the one young girl in Italy who their choice right from the beginning was to go the antibiotic route. And I don't believe we have anybody using the supports who isn't seeing progress. What I would say is the most unbiased way to get feedback, go on the chat group, post the question, and ask those individuals on the chat group who are using the program if anybody's used it and not seen progress yet. I don't believe that there's anyone who hasn't seen progress. But I think a much more unbiased way to do it is just post on the chat group and ask them. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Well, I think that going from a positive H. pylori test to a negative H. pylori test, given the technology we have right now, isn't conclusive. And that's why we're working with individuals at the moment to get a tighter PCR-based H. pylori test. Because in theory, if PCR works properly, if you have one copy, you should be able to amplify it up and see it and get a positive. And right now, the threshold is probably, I believe it's 1 times 10 to the third, so about 1,000 copies have to be seen in order to amplify it up and see it. And so our goal is working with analytical labs to try to be able to see H. pylori at a lower threshold. At that point, we should be able to have a PCR test that's more meaningful than what we have now. What we can follow, though, is to see that that subaric level comes down in time, to see that the manganese level goes up. We watch for a bell-shaped curve of the cadmium excretion, and we get beyond the cadmium. We get the pH of the gut in a normal range. We start to see a clean CSA. We're not seeing the inflammatory markers on a CSA or a GI function. We're not seeing blood in the stool. So some of the more indirect indicators are improving, as well as behavior and language. That's improving. But right now, I do agree it's very difficult to quantitate, do you have it or don't you, particularly because a negative antibody test isn't even meaningful. Getting back to arginine that we talked about at length earlier, arginine also plays a role in methylation. And so arginine methylation of a huge number of genes in the body is a global regulatory process. And so that arginine that's being depleted by the H. pylori, the lack of arginine and the lack of arginine methylation is playing a role for all of these genes. So every gene you see listed here requires arginine methylation for regulation. And these genes are involved in RNA processing, signal transduction, transcriptional regulation, DNA repair, cancer, cardiovascular disease, viral pathogenesis, and MS. And so it's yet another consequence of H. pylori, but also just sort of expanding on the importance of methylation, not just at a DNA level, but also methylation of arginine. And recall, and we've talked about this a lot in the past, methylation is important for viral silencing. If we don't have adequate methylation, we have more virus. Virus can hang on to cadmium. Cadmium can affect CFTR function. And that's just in addition to whatever else we have going on for cadmium and Helicobacter. And so, again, cadmium is regulating the expression of this gene. And you've seen already on the last set of PowerPoints how much cadmium we're getting out of these kids. And so if cadmium regulates this gene, we know already we're going to have some problems here given the level of cadmium. But virus in the system will hang on to cadmium as well as a number of other metals. And there are some viruses that are very specific for absorption of cadmium in the body. And so again, looking at cadmium exposure and enhancing issues that are involved with viral infection, and absorption of cadmium being greater in individuals with viral issues than those who are non-infected. And if we look at the increase in cadmium in those with infection and controls, look at the difference of cadmium accumulation that we're seeing in the liver and the whole body just by viral infection. So if we don't have enough methylation and we can't silence the virus, and the virus is going to allow for more cadmium, cadmium is going to impair our CFTR. If we have impaired CFTR and impaired methylation, we've got more mucus. We already have acidity issues if we have impaired methylation because of lack of B12, and we've set up this scenario where I guess it shouldn't be surprising that we're seeing so much Helicobacter in the population we're dealing with. Also, differences in methylation can account for differences in susceptibility to cadmium toxicity. And just a number of other articles showing the relationship between imbalances in metallothionein, viral infection, and the amount of cadmium that the body will hang on to. And so just viral-induced myocarditis with cadmium concentration. Back to the eyes again, because I have to say it broke my heart when I got the letter from that mom about an 8-year-old boy where it was glaucoma. And, you know, Helicobacter playing a role, but also keeping in mind that you can have heavy concentrations of cadmium and lead in the eyes. And what's inducing the cadmium into the system in the first place? Is it the binding protein for cadmium that Helicobacter has? Is it viral infection in the body? Regardless, both issues we want to be dealing with. Increased intestinal absorption of cadmium when we have a viral infection. Now, lithium I'm going to talk about a little more now because I do think lithium is another critical piece of the puzzle. I spoke about this at length last summer in Boston and touched on it a little bit earlier. But lithium can actually play a role in protecting the body against cadmium. And when we finish the PowerPoint we're on now, we're going to go to another one of those data PowerPoints where you don't have to think, you just have to look at pictures and see how prevalent low lithium is in all of the files that I'm seeing. And so lithium will protect against the toxic effects of cadmium. And we can see that in data form, but a picture's worth 1,000 words. So this is what we're looking at when we have a problem with cadmium. This one is, it's hard to tell. Okay. This is if we add cadmium but we add lithium, and this is the control. And so the control with no cadmium essentially looks identical to cadmium plus lithium. That's how much it's protecting the tissue from cadmium, as compared to when you add cadmium and there's no lithium for control. Okay? So low lithium, when we have cadmium issues, when we have Helicobacter issues, when we have viral issues, compounds the problem because these cells are being damaged when we don't have lithium for protection. Cadmium, as well as other toxic metals, can impair BH4, and we talked about BH4 a little earlier, and lithium may also help to offset the problems with BH4. And so we know BH4 activity is severely impacted by toxic metals, including the one we're talking about today being cadmium. Yet lithium will increase those BH4 levels. And so as well as helping to protect against cadmium, lithium is playing a role in perhaps helping to protect those BH4 levels. And I'll go through these pretty quickly because we did look at these slides this past summer in Boston, and I'm assuming those are up, on my site or on the chat group. But lithium plays a role in helping B12 to get into the body. And so we talked earlier about the relationship between an acid gut and lack of B12. Not enough lithium may be part of the reason we're not pulling B12 in, so that the body is compensating by increasing stomach acid, which then creates a scenario where Helicobacter is attracted to bind. And so keeping in mind the role that lithium plays with B12 binding and how critical it is to have healthy levels of lithium in the body. Again, lithium-induced imbalances in B12, folic, and DNA metabolism. And so lithium ingestion is associated with elevated levels of B12 binding capacity. And sometimes if you're adding a lot of B12 and you're not seeing cobalt on a UEE, oftentimes I'm finding it's because we don't have enough lithium in the body to help to actually transport in that B12 that you're ingesting. Again, another article, so it's not just Dr. Amy saying this, but we're seeing this from multiple articles, that lithium levels significantly increase the cellular uptake of B12 into the body, and that imbalances in B12 deficiency may be related to depression and psychosis in part by virtue of the fact that it's related to low lithium. And I'm sorry this one is so fuzzy. A couple of them didn't blow up well. But again, B12 transport related to the need for lithium, and it looks like an energy-dependent process. Again, lithium enhances folate and B12 transport into cells, and so showing that lithium is helping to get that B12 into those cells. And again, if we don't have B12, the stomach will make more acid. More acid allows for more Helicobacter binding. Again, yet another article showing this relationship between lithium and B12 transport. And again, profound B12 deficiency associated with violent behavior, mania, self-pity, negativism, paranoid, aggression, but also low lithium. And low lithium seen in the scalp of violent individuals, and some of the kids, the temper tantrums and aggression, and we'll see this in the next PowerPoint, are alleviated simply by low-dose lithium to help to support the body in a normal, natural range. Also, other imbalances in the methylation cycle that play a role in bipolar and schizophrenia. And so, is this because we have low lithium and we're not pulling B12 into the system? Lithium also helps to control norepinephrine. And if you recall earlier, I told you that too much norepinephrine increases the level of H. pylori. And so keeping an eye on lithium levels on these tests, not just about behavior, not just about B12 transport, but the role that it may be playing with respect to this insidious Helicobacter infection. Lithium may also relate to some of the ion transport we're seeing with the cystic fibrosis transmembrane gene, because lithium is playing a role in ion transport when we're looking at sodium and potassium. Other positives of lithium. First of all, lithium, I know people worry about too high a dose being toxic, but there are RDAs for lithium, natural normal levels that have been established. And the average daily intake is supposed to be 3.1 milligrams. And if we look at using about a half a lithium orotate a day, that's only 2.4 milligrams. And we're generally using levels lower than that. And the newer glutamate GABA spray that hopefully will be available very soon has even lower levels than that. So if you're concerned about adding too much, maybe look at the glutamate GABA spray or look at just a fraction of the lithium orotate. Yes? To be honest with you, I don't know what a dietary source would be. Based on what I'm seeing, it can't be very significant because we're finding that virtually everyone's needing to supplement. And so, okay. So certain areas of the country, it's in the tap water. And, other than that, I think we're looking at support. On any of this, work with your doctor, look at tests, look at a UEE, look at a hair metal test, and we'll look at some of those in a short while to see the kinds of levels we see before supplementation, what we need to be looking at. What happens if you don't have enough lithium? Well, it's going to play a role when it comes to dopamine synthesis. It's going to play a role when it comes to GABA. It's going to play a role in terms of those minerals that are involved in the mitochondria, as well as huge number of other roles it's playing, whether it's the sleep cycle, whether it's ion channels, whether it's lipid composition. The 5-HTP receptors, acetylcholine, not even touching on what is happening with BH4 or cadmium or anything else we talked about today. Lithium helps to prevent against excitotoxicity. And I assume anyone who's on this program knows about excitotoxins, is paying attention to glutamate and GABA and calcium and excitotoxin flow. But it's one of the tools you actually have to prevent from excitotoxin damage. And similar to what we saw with the cadmium slide and lithium, if we look at what control cells should look like, we look at what glutamate does to cells, and then we look at what lithium plus glutamate does. It helps to protect those cells. Visually, you can see it. And we're looking at this in cortical neurons, okay? So this is what we're talking about in terms of having sufficient, adequate level of lithium in the body, and a dose-dependent effect of lithium on glutamate-induced damage. And this is true whether we're looking at chronic or just acute concentrations. Opposing effects of astrocytes and neurons make lithium treatment a promising strategy for neural repair after traumatic injury. And we know from some of the work of others in autism that this balance between the astrocytes and the neurons is a problem in autism. And low-dose lithium helping to shift the balance towards neural repair rather than having imbalances and inflammation. Back to the mitochondria again, because I do think the mitochondria is so critical for fine motor control, gross motor control, language. I had one young girl who, once we got the mitochondria under control, was able to walk again because at 2 she had gone back to crawling and all of her language returned. And I've never forgotten how critical just getting the mitochondria under control was with her language. And lithium will help with the mitochondrial function also. Lithium inducing the expression of BDNF, which is another one of those genes involved in language. Again, neuroprotective activity against assaults to the body. Looking at the neuroprotective action of lithium. Looking at novel roles that lithium may play. And so lithium at several points in this pathway, where this is a pathway involved with the synapses, neuroplasticity, new nerve growth, nerve flexibility, and this is the same pathway we look at with ERK in terms of looking at what's necessary for language development. Again, looking at specific genes that are protected by lithium and the role again of this BDNF gene. Lithium as a therapeutic against acute brain injury as well as chronic neurological issues. Looking at the range of references for the regenerative and protective effect of lithium. And again, looking at how lithium can block overstimulation and excitotoxicity in the brain. So preventing excess activity at the NMDA receptors, helping to upregulate certain brain factors that help with language, helping with differentiation, helping with regeneration of nerves that have been damaged. Looking at lithium's effect on yet another gene that has a role in language as well as mitochondrial function. And also the role lithium plays in modulating the polyamines that we've talked about several times today. Lithium affects methylation because it helps to transport MB12. Lack of methylation allows for increased viral loads and increased cadmium, and lithium helps to protect us from that. This methylation plays a role in CFTR function, plays a role in susceptibility to H. pylori, and is necessary for more generalized health. And I've scanned in several pages from this book on molecular pathology, just in terms of reference for the future, the role methylation plays in human disease. And it's a very well written, excellent article that I've scanned in the entire chapter here for those who want to take a look at it later, how critical it is, not just for your child, but for yourselves in terms of looking at long-term problems and issues if you're not supporting your methylation cycle. Yes? Oh, where it came from? Hold on. Oh, this one you want, okay. The role of mutation and epimutation in the development of human disease, and it's from Basic Concepts in Molecular Pathology. But they're going to, they'll post these PowerPoints and also the DVD of the talk too. And along those lines, we've been working for several years to make the article database that I work from for all these articles accessible to everyone. And we're getting really close. And so I would say in the next 3 to 6 months, there will be a link either from the chat group or my personal website or the Holistic Heal site where you'll be able to go on there and search by keyword. And so if you want to see all of the articles that I looked at, those I've presented, as well as those I may not have presented about lithium, you can type in lithium as a keyword and you'll see the first page of all of those articles. Or if you want to go back and pull up any articles that I might have used on H. pylori or excitotoxins, the article database I work from, I don't know, I probably have about 15,000 articles in it. And all you need to do is search by keyword, and that gives you the third-party peer-reviewed literature that's support for all of the programs that I come up with. Another article just finishing up on why epigenetics is so important, and it actually is the mirror of what goes on in our environment, and that methylation and epigenetics aren't just about gene function in terms of do we turn on or turn off a gene, but behavior and inherited characteristics for behavior. And so the same pathway that we basically look at is the pathway that's being looked at for epigenetics. And I gave this example yesterday, a slightly different slide, but I'll reiterate it today because it's so critical. These mice were genetically identical. And what they did was look at a normal mouse, a mouse where they've induced a mutation, but they've supplemented, and a mouse where they did not supplement. And the difference is that you can supplement the folate pathway and bypass the mutations so that it looks like a normal mouse. And these epigenetics, the methylation and support, have an effect on behavior also. And these behaviors are actually acquired and inherited behaviors in animal model studies. And so methylation supplementation, it can direct changes in these markers. These can be inherited, and supporting methionine, which is why we look at that so critically in the methylation cycle, is enough to make a difference in some of these cases. But we'll see in the next slide or two, methionine alone isn't enough. You want the entire methylation cycle to be supported, not just methionine. And so while methionine can play a role, it's not enough to bypass some of the mutations. For some of those mutations, we need methylation cycle function in order to balance out these behaviors. And finally, this is the last thinking slide, and then we'll just go look at pictures and ask questions. A recent article out of Neuron, which is an extremely highly respected journal, and they're looking at the role of epigenetics and understanding the interaction between genes and the environment. And basically what they're saying is methylation is your connection between what goes on in the environment and what's going on in your system. We can't change your genes, but we can change how those genes are methylated. And that plays a role, whether we're talking about Helicobacter or whether we're talking about control for that CFTR gene, or whether we're talking about excitotoxin damage. We really want to make sure the methylation cycle is in balance as a starting point, and then maybe move on as the next step to look at something like Helicobacter in the system. Okay. I need your help again to get to our last PowerPoint. Thank you. And lithium data. Thank you. Thank you. This will be the last one, and this is pretty short, and then we can do questions and call it a day. I've spoken about this female before, and sudden onset psychosis for no apparent reason. And she was not autistic. She was on the program for control of seizure disorder, had that under control, and she had kind of gotten away from the program, and we didn't have testing for a number of years until she came back to me because she was working with Johns Hopkins and a number of other institutions, and no one could get the psychosis under control. And while she does have a number of mutations, not as severe as what we often see. And so that alone, I don't believe, can explain the problem. And just the issues as she goes through getting worse in terms of the psychotic state. And we're using these with the permission of the mom, even though I've blacked out the name. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sharing these. But some of the severe issues this individual is dealing with. And we look at a UEE finally, because there was a lot of years where we weren't getting test data. And she appears to be dumping lithium in her urine, which is usually a first indication of a problem, especially because she wasn't supplementing any lithium. It would be one thing if she was supplementing lithium and dumping, and generally when that happens you see a higher number, but she's just dumping lithium. And when we look on a hair test, we're seeing very low lithium levels. And when we did blood work, the levels were extremely low. The reference range in blood should be 0.5, and she's sitting at 0.3. And so we began by using lithium orotate, supplement levels, and no matter what we did, we were unable to get those levels into normal range. And so finally, what we ended up having to do was using prescription level lithium in order to get those lithium levels in range. And so you can see over time how much prescription level lithium was necessary in order to get her into normal range. And the reason I'm showing this is I know that some of the parents, I'll see very low lithium on a hair test, and I'll suggest that they consider low-dose lithium support. As always, work with your doctor, but think about lithium orotate in a low dose, think about the glutamate GABA spray, and some parents are afraid to add it. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is, number one, lack of lithium is more dangerous in my mind than adding low-dose lithium. And look at how much it took of prescription strength lithium to get within range. And so if we look at what the minimum daily requirement is and how little we would be adding, you really want to think about adding it if your levels are low, because some of the consequences, as we're seeing, of low lithium are quite significant. This is one of the adults we have on the site who volunteered and wanted to share this information, excuse me, where he had a history of schizophrenia, a number of methylation cycle mutations that we've worked on, and just sharing some of what he felt and had been going through before we got his system in balance. And at this point, he had no more positive symptoms, no more hyperexcitability. All of the symptoms have gone. He's actually back at school getting his PhD right now. And you know, after all the years of schizophrenia, he's now back in balance. And one of the things he wanted to share was how important the supplement schedule as well as low-dose lithium was for him. And if we look at what his hair lithium levels look like, horrendously low. And I'm actually seeing levels like this that we'll see in a few minutes on some of the kids' tests. And so, you know, not to say, you know, 20 years from now, untreated, anyone would be in the same boat that this individual was, but just recognizing that that isn't a normal, healthy range to be sitting for lithium, and that it does have consequences on the body. And just finally getting his lithium into better balance in his system, working on his methylation cycle. And so what he wanted me to share with everyone was his positive reaction to it. And he just wants to make sure that other people can benefit from his experience and learning that this is an important supplement to be in his system, and how more testing would have helped solve his problems sooner. Looking at just when we're dealing with aggression now, and a number of the kids have issues with aggression, and even if there aren't that many mutations, the need for lithium support. And so low lithium in the system and low lithium, and just looking to support to get better balance. 15-year-old with aggression, and just going back through the files, finding a history of low lithium levels and escalating anger. And then once we started him on low-dose lithium, continued progress, positive mood changes, and getting to where we needed to be. And looking at, you know, where we finally have him in a more normal range. This parent, again, wanted to share her information and her experience that using the lithium to try to help with the aggressive behaviors and also for anxiety. And we're not using really high doses. We're looking at very low doses below the recommended daily allowance, but just keeping this in mind and keeping in mind that relationship between lithium and cadmium and H. pylori and cadmium and the cystic fibrosis gene, and how we want to get to the root of some of these problems with respect to Helicobacter. A 10-year-old male with severe anxiety. And going back over the file again and looking at the need for lithium levels. And looking at the lithium dumping. Oftentimes we'll see lithium dumping, high excretion, when it's obvious we're not adding it, before we see those really low levels in hair. A female with high level anxiety, other imbalances in the methylation cycle, looking at some of her other anxiety and attention issues, and again, looking for that lithium dumping. 8-year-old with anxiety and aggression, looking at incapable of forming words, looking at the higher level of lithium dumping again. 6-year-old with aggression. Major behaviors, acting like Jekyll and Hyde, anxiety issues, OCD. We're not seeing much of a problem here, but then follow-up testing, we're seeing lithium dumping and continued lithium dumping. We don't need to be looking at those. But just being aware of the fact that you want to be looking at what's going on a hair metal test, looking at what's happening on a UEE. If we have high-level excretion, if we have low-level, regardless of some of the nutrigenomics, if you're seeing something like this on a hair test, work with your doctor to try to get some lithium support in place. If you're seeing lithium dumping and you haven't run a hair test to see if it's low. Again, taking a look at lithium levels. Okay, low in the hair, look on a UEE, and if you don't supplement, look at the fact that it'll drop lower. So we're low here, we continue, it's just going to keep going. And so ignoring the problem isn't going to help. Yes, Peter? I haven't had that circumstance, but if that's going on, I would probably go for, did everybody hear Peter's question? What she's asking is, if you have low lithium in the hair, and then you start to supplement with lithium, so you know you're supplementing, because now you start to see appropriate lithium dumping on a UEE, saying, yes, I'm adding it. It's not the dumping that you see if you haven't added anything. But the hair test isn't moving. You're not seeing an improvement in the lithium in the hair. At that point, I would probably do what I did with the very first individual, run a blood lithium level, and you might need to go to prescription strength lithium, because that's what we needed to do with her. She was using, I think, at least 1, maybe 2 lithium orotate a day at one point, and we couldn't get those levels to move. And as you can see, I mean, she's probably using 15 mils of prescription lithium a day to keep her at low range normal. I mean, she's not even high range normal. And so I think I'd go to a blood lithium at that point. Related to that, there seems to be a connection, and I did talk about it this summer, between certain methylation cycle mutations and particularly low lithium. And when we have MTR mutations or MTR++, those individuals tend to have a more significant issue with low lithium. At this point, though, I don't know why, so I don't have a workaround for it at this point, other than to say to go to the blood lithium. And again, and all we're doing at this point is looking at test after test to show you that this isn't a one-time phenomena, it's not a one-person phenomena. We're seeing this in older individuals, younger individuals, little girls, little boys, older boys, adult women, that we really need to be looking at what's going on lithium on a UEE and a hair metal test. And also the fact that the methylation cycle is going to play a role here. And so again, just more of these pictures. Just reiterating the fact that you want to be looking at lithium dumping, low hair metal tests, and coordinating it with balance for the entire methylation cycle. And so if we're seeing lithium being excreted and you're not supplementing it, you want to be running a hair test and think about lithium supplementation. And just again, the need for methylation cycle balance in addition to lithium support, because one alone isn't going to help. Even if you're supplementing lithium, if you don't have methylation cycle balance, we're going to have problems. And the MTR mutation that I just spoke about, that seems to be a more significant issue with lithium. If you have your genetics, if you've got an MTR mutation, just pay a little closer attention to what's going on with a hair metal test, with a UEE in terms of these lithium levels. And just being sure that you also have your methylation cycle in balance. If your taurine is sitting here, you don't have your methylation cycle in balance. And that's also going to play a role with respect to where we are with lithium levels. And again, reiterating this connection between MTR, methylation cycle support, and lithium imbalances. So going back over some of the tests you have at home, looking at a hair metal test, see if lithium is very low in hair, see if you're dumping lithium in urine, and supporting at a low level in conjunction with your doctor. And this is just more and more of the same. This one, as we were talking, this male is 42 years old. Who knows how long that lithium has been that low? It's frightening to think of, you know, and how long it's going to take to get that in balance when we're sitting that low for that long for that many years. And even if you don't have nutrigenomics, still take a look at your lithium levels, because it's critical. Even if you don't have the nutrigenomic testing, make sure that you're not dumping your lithium or that they're not too low. Okay, you don't want to be sitting there. And just going backwards a moment to highlight, you really want your methylation cycle in balance. Whether your taurine's too high, if you've got high FIGLU, you want to be getting methylation cycle in balance, not just looking at some of these individual highlights and getting those in balance. And just looking at where you want the lithium actually to be sitting. Somewhere in this green range is where you want your lithium sitting. Yes? I don't tend to see the lithium levels fluctuating when we're getting the methylation cycle imbalance in detox, but I do sometimes see the lithium levels fluctuating when we're working on Helicobacter. And so when you get some of those massive dumps of cadmium or the bismuth is being excreted, you want to keep a closer eye on lithium levels because it may be more of an issue. Yes? Okay. All right. The question is, why do I want to cycle on and off peptimycin? Two reasons. One is that I always err on the side of conservative. Bismuth used at a high dose, long-term, over time, isn't ideal for the body. Having said that, the amount of bismuth that's in peptimycin is low enough that you could use it every day. But I always like to be careful, so I'd rather have you cycle on and off so we don't have to worry. The other thing is Helicobacter hides. And so my concern is, even though there's no studies to say that if you are continually going after it, and adding bicarbonate to throw off its orientation and using RNAs to help and using every natural supplement under the sun at the same time to go after it, that it will develop mechanisms to become resistant. I want to make sure that doesn't happen. And so the other reason for cycling is to trick it into not getting used to what we're doing. If you really feel that your child is doing better staying on it all the time, and your doctor's okay with you staying on it all the time, That's all right to do too. You don't have to cycle. It's partially my being cautious and also my concern that I don't want a situation where the Helicobacter gets smart enough to bypass the techniques we have to go after it. I'm sorry, I can't hear your second question. Yeah, that's the first thing I'd think of. He's not the only one who has trouble going off the peptimycin and needs to stay on it. And we do have individuals that are staying on the program and not going off of it. And a situation like his where he's got horrendous reflux if he goes off of it, that might be a circumstance where you do want to stay on it until you can reach a point where you can cycle on and off or go up and down. In terms of the tryptamine, the most effective way to address it that I've found is low-dose feverfew seems to work really well. And so that when we follow up on those neurotransmitter tests, we're pulling those levels right down with low-dose feverfew. No, that would be the tryptamine. Yeah. Yes. Okay, erring on the side of caution, what I usually have people do is cycle 3 weeks on the HELX, the baking soda with meals, and the peptimycin, and then take a week to 3 weeks off. A number of individuals, though, are finding that they feel better staying on and not going off. So in those cases, I've suggested that they consider just decreasing the amount of peptimycin, stay on the baking soda, stay on the HELX, and then just go back up. It's probably going to vary from individual to individual, and I know you're a doctor, so I don't have to tell you to work with your doctor, but the general statement is work with your doctor on it. You know, in terms of adjusting. But I do have a number of individuals who aren't cycling on and off also. Yes. Oh, what happens is that if you have ketosis, and so you're not feeding into the Krebs cycle appropriately, that it can shunt towards aspartate, and that will increase alpha Kg. And so if you have just elevated alpha Kg and everything else in the cycle is low, it may be a sign that you've got ketosis or early stage ketosis. Yes. Cadmium is toxic for it, so it binds it and then it spits it out. Yeah.
So, in terms of like Candida and H. pylori, are they together, or does Candida not exist? Or I'm confused on how that all works in the gut.
You mean a? Oh, the example I was giving was I do think a lot of the kids have yeast infections. And we do see yeast on a CSA or a GI function, and I definitely think it needs to be addressed if it's there. We have a number of ways we do it in this program. There's a number of other ways that others deal with it, and I think that's a definite issue. What I don't want people to be lulled into thinking, because for years the rule of thumb was, inappropriate laughter means yeast. And what I'm saying is inappropriate laughter may mean yeast, or inappropriate laughter may mean high tryptamine, which is a sign of H. pylori. And so if your child is sitting at the table and suddenly laughing inappropriately at dinner, it could be yeast, but it could be H. pylori. And part of where we got this feedback from the 14, 15-year-old girl with the psychosis, she's very verbal. And so she would do that. She would just start to laugh. But she's not autistic, so she can explain. And her mom would say, "What are you laughing at?" And she would be like, "Oh, yeah, the pink bunny over there was just talking to me." Or the purple tortoise. Or, yes, so-and-so over there. Have whole conversations with imaginary individuals in the room, but she would talk about what she was seeing. And when we ran the neurotransmitter test, that was when we saw the very high tryptamine. And when we pull the tryptamine down, it's associated with not seeing these things.
So can you treat both at the same time?
Yes.
And like my husband and I are both from third world countries, so does that increase, like my son is autistic, does that increase his chance of having H. pylori since we both eat maybe a variety of things?
I actually think that the incidence in autism is already so high that it wouldn't matter. You're welcome. Yes. What we're finding is helping is low-dose feverfew, which is an herb. And that herb is very popular for migraines and has worked for years on migraines. And it's interesting because there are certain studies and indications that suggest that migraine headaches are associated with excess stomach acid. And so who knows if some of the triggers for migraines are very related to some of the same pathways we're looking at.
Does a family history of glaucoma play into whether you would be more susceptible to the H. pylori?
I honestly don't know, to tell you the truth. I mean, I think that with that history, I would certainly look at the H. pylori and work very hard on cadmium and lead toxicity and binding it and trying to pull it out of the system. Yes? Just a handful, and in those cases, the tryptamine levels have been high. Right. Right. They're all in the same pathway. And so when you have serotonin, tryptamine, and tryptophan, 5-hydroxyindolacetic acid, they're all part of the same pathway. And right now it's not clear why it would shunt more towards tryptamine, let's say, rather than hydroxyindolacetic acid in a particular individual, particularly because the same enzymes are involved in the breakdown. But the enzymes that are involved in breaking down, let's say, serotonin, MAOA, that's an enzyme that needs copper for function, and the manganese can antagonize the copper. And so I believe that some of the manganese imbalances that we see and copper imbalances we're seeing are related to impairment of some of those enzymes, and that's going on. And I do think it's tied together in part by the Helicobacter infection, but there may be other mutations we're not picking up on or we have no way to screen for in the body that could be playing a role. I know on the nutrigenomic test we do look at MAOA, but we only have one MAOA SNP because a lot of them haven't been characterized. And so it may be in some individuals they're preferentially breaking down to tryptamine because of genetics rather than breaking down to other intermediates in the body. And so I think, limiting turkey a little bit as a tryptophan source may help a bit. Yes?
Question about the gut pH. We're always taught, and I was told that H. pylori is only in the stomach. Stomach acid is low, pH changes, and then of course the digestive system, and then what's getting measured on the test would be the stool pH.
Yes.
So how does that all relate to each other?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
pH is not the same in all parts of the intestine.
Right.
So what is the relevance of the stool pH to understanding whether H. pylori is present or not?
What we're looking at is what we can measure as an indicator of what's going on. And so what we know is that if the pH of the stool is way too acidic, way too low, that we're having more issues with H. pylori, presumably because the stool pH shouldn't be that low. And if it is that low, it says we've got a much more acid environment than we would expect. And we know from the literature we looked at today that an acid environment induces H. pylori binding to mucin 1. And so it's increasing the likelihood that H. pylori is an issue. Therefore, in my mind, it means look at more tests to try to see if it's there. Conversely, we don't really expect the stool pH to be tremendously alkaline. We really want it balanced. And so if it's tremendously alkaline, the question is why? And it could be very likely that H. pylori, through the induction of urease, is neutralizing stomach pH, and so now we're way the other direction. And again, using it as an indicator to say, we need to look more at this picture. And so I'm not suggesting purely based on a low pH or a high pH to address H. pylori, actually quite the converse. What I've done within my own personal practice is to say, other than a UTM, UEE, a fecal metal, or a hair test, we no longer are willing to use any of the other biochemical tests individually. And we only will look at them in a bundle so that I can look across the board and say, okay, I think we have a problem across the board. Because you do bring up a good point that an isolated stool test with a low pH or high pH may or may not be totally indicative, although we can kind of connect the dotted lines here and say, given everything we know, it seems very likely if you're seeing that, especially if you've got more than one stool test from around the same time. And I'm sure, you've seen some of these where you've got this wide pH swing, that one test is showing 5 and the other one is showing over 7. Those are the ones where I'm really highly suspicious. And then if I look at a map and the need for carnitine is very high, those are some really strong indicators in my opinion. Yes?
How long are you using the bicarbonate orally? Because at some point that's going to be counterproductive because you're going to stop mineral absorption.
Well, the thing is, and someone asked it, but the reality is, you don't want to be using bicarb with meals unless you know you have H. pylori. But if you have H. pylori, it's already neutralizing that stomach acid. And so you're really in a situation where you don't have much choice. The only thing that's going to disorient the H. pylori, according to these studies, is playing with that bicarbonate level because that's what disorients it. If you don't add bicarbonate to try to get it out of hiding, then it's already neutralizing the stomach acid to begin with. So that's why we do the cycling on, cycling off, though, because I like to err on the side of caution. And also I feel like they're hiding and they're smart. And so if you have the pressure on from a couple of different angles, and then you take that pressure off, you're more likely to draw them out and then go after it again. And that would make sense. We don't always see high tryptamine, but sometimes we see high 5-hydroxyindoleacetic acid. And they're both part of the same pathway. And so you may not see high levels of both. You may see one or the other, but if you do see high levels, that would certainly be an indicator to look further and consider addressing it. Thank you. Hey, good to see you. Yes. I don't know that we've seen that as an issue. But again, my approach in the program is low doses of a number of different supplements given at the same time. And so we're not using massive doses of anything. And so that's why I don't think it's enough to be throwing anything off terribly. Yes. My gut instinct would be, sorry for the pun, would be that it would be that it's detox and it's die-off. Because some of those studies with the L-reuteri are, I mean, I'm pretty amazed at how well that works. And with the pandas, with the strep, you see some pretty significant die-off behaviors too. I'd look at serotonin levels because that's so tied together with some of that. You're really not in a good place if you've got pandas and strep and the high TNF-alpha and serotonin levels and imbalances in OCD, and then you layer on the Helicobacter, which is also fooling around in that same serotonin pathway. Things that might help to balance TNF-alpha levels might help, something like nettle, which works on that, or some of the RNAs help with some of those inflammatory pathways. That might be helpful. But there also may be a massive detox. I know that at least one individual, when we started to utilize this program, the amount of thallium excreted was unbelievable, just massive pouring out of thallium. And so, it could be detox. The other thing is maybe the feverfew might help, to offset neurotransmitter imbalances relative to going after the H. pylori. Yeah.
Suggested for my son to start on the baking soda, but we haven't done enough testing altogether to actually diagnose for pylori. But I guess you're assuming he has it, but you haven't said to start with peptomycin or anything. So do we just continue with the baking soda until we, before meals, until we do the other testing, or do we still cycle back?
I don't know. I would have to look at the file to see why I would have said one without the other, because... Okay, all right. It was probably because I didn't... Yeah, but I wasn't willing to move forward without more information. I think I would anyway. Just, yeah, that's what I would, yes. LJ, oh. The C677T or the 3? Was, yes. That's a really good question, LJ. On the panel that we run, the MTHFR3, I believe, is a more significant mutation than even the C677T. And so I would think that with an MTHFR3, that would be applicable as it is with the C677T, perhaps even more so. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Have you seen any, had any experience doing this program with a patient, let's say an adult with ulcer disease who's had a biopsy positive H. pylori, using this treatment approach?
No, I understand what you're saying. I don't know if we have anybody doing that or not. It's possible. I hate to sound like I'm hedging, but years ago I actually had a private practice where I would work with a set number of individuals. And the way the program works now is there's probably over 10,000 people on the chat group. And then if some of those people choose to send testing through me for my feedback, like this comprehensive program review, I'll write up what my suggestions and thoughts are, but the idea is they have to go back and work with their own doctor. So it's very possible that there are individuals that you're talking about doing this, but they're working with someone in particular, and I'm not seeing that feedback data, so I wouldn't know. I think there's enough adults on the site using the program. I'd be really surprised if somebody hadn't done that. And Erin could probably, post a question to the adults and find out, because generally someone will come back to me if things aren't working, if they're not finding. But for instance, if it was one of your patients who ran the comprehensive program, I made suggestions and I sent them back to you. If they get better, I don't hear from them, which is good, and that's fine and as it should be. So I'm not sure, but Erin could probably find out for us.
I missed the association between the low glutathione, was it increased mucin secretion? You said the secondary property of reduced glutathione is promotion of mucolysis, which I thought the relationship of
I think that there is a number of papers in that area. What I would say is glutathione levels certainly affect mucus levels and mucus production and the breakdown of mucus so it's more elastic and flexible. And so what the concern is with cystic fibrosis is that low glutathione levels are part of what's adding to this not as flexible mucus layer. And so it may be applicable to what we're looking at, that low levels of glutathione would be helpful if that's a factor. The other thing is one of the digestive enzymes I like to use. We use a special digestive enzyme that's very, very high in pancreatin. That's suggested for any individuals on the program because I think the pancreas is a real weak spot for everyone on the program. But we're also using certain digestive enzymes that are actually designed more for breaking up mucus for upper respiratory issues. But I find that the combination of that with the special digestive enzymes is making a difference also. I do think biofilms are bad, and I'm okay with using enzymes against them. What we also do, which we didn't get into today, is there's a compounded supplement we have called natromycin, which is essentially a huge number of herbs all in one place that should be helpful in terms of addressing those kinds of bacterial issues, but also something called Bactisolve. And Bactisolve is EDTA as well as certain chitosins in particular lengths designed to help to destabilize bacterial outer membranes and some of those complexes. And so there are definitely other parts of the program to use some. I focused in on Helicobacter today because no one else is talking about it. And I've talked about some of the other things before, so they're kind of out there. But Helicobacter lithium and cystic fibrosis is something no one else is touching, and so I felt it was important to get that out there to the audience. Yeah, Peg. Yes.
I know Mitt and a number of the other children have developed big throaty coughs as a consequence of starting the air power. An indication that they've got a lot of mucus in there.
It would certainly, yeah, I would think so. I would definitely think so. Because that's, I mean, the air power is very low dose guaifenesin. If you look at Mucinex, which I didn't want because it's got other fillers and it's not natural, one of those tablets is 600 milligrams. And the air power, the reason I picked it, it's all natural, but it's only 100. It doesn't mean you can't go up in dose again, work with your doctor, but just as a reference point, my middle daughter, who probably weighs about 110 pounds, when she had an upper respiratory infection, she used 2 of the Mucinex in a day. And the youngest one, who's the ballet dancer, actually uses guaifenesin every day because its mode of action actually is to help with calcium and potassium transport. And so she uses about 100, 150 milligrams a day, more to prevent muscle soreness in her body than for anything else. And she's about 100 pounds. So I think, you know, you probably could go up a bit if you need, or make sure that you've got some of that Cerezyme in the system to help to break down the mucus also. But I would think that would be an indicator that there actually is a you know, fact. And Mitt was one of the individuals that I screened, and he's negative for cystic fibrosis carrier for any of the markers we looked at so far. Yes.
Have you seen any evidence of the patients that you've worked with that have been improving on the H. pylori program, that it's helping to balance maybe existing high taurine levels?
Kimmy, are taurine levels doing better at this point for Baxter? Yeah. Okay. Well, because, right.
My daughter does. Right, but we didn't have calcium taurine at all. So, okay, I didn't run a math, or I ran a UAA for a while. And then I ran one, and it was hot. And I was so surprised. What's going on? Yeah, and then, so having the H. pylori program and choose line actually helped with the high taurine? Yeah. Okay, that's what I'm looking for. I have about 3 or 4 patients on the digestive enzymes who aren't tolerating medicine. They actually make them worse, they'll say. They have heartburn and stomach upset. It's more of a acid issue. And it's all of the patients who have a lot of stomach acid.
The digestive enzymes are certainly designed to help to do a better job breaking down fats, and they're very high in pancreatin. If Helicobacter is an issue because of the stomach acid that you're seeing already anyway, it may be that they're more in the range of ketosis already, and so breaking down fats is a problem. I really like the new, and I'm pretty positive it's out there already, the CoQ10 spray, because the CoQ10 spray actually has intermediates that'll feed right into the glycolysis pathway at the same time. And one of the tricks I've used for several individuals with ketosis is to use that CoQ10 spray. And so what you might try is see if the CoQ10 spray plus some additional carnitine first then enables them to tolerate the digestive enzymes. Because chances are they actually really need the digestive enzymes. So, oh no. Well, and also the bowel RNA may help with absorption, and the oral amino acid spray, so that you're not expecting to get through the digestive tract. They would be an ideal family then for something like bowel RNA, CoQ10 spray, amino assist spray, so everything is absorbed here instead of trying to get through the gut. The Bowel Plus is just stronger. Yeah. You're welcome.
I was just wondering what special care you would need to take in interpreting your panel of tests in someone that's undergoing chelation, oral chelation.
What type of oral chelation? What I would say is, since I don't feel that maybe integrates as well into the program because I have certain reservations about sulfur and that sort of thing, maybe finish that course of chelation and then kind of come into the program from there on a clean, fresh slate would probably be the best I would suggest. I mean, the other thing is that, again, you could post on the site, see if somebody else is integrating that well into the program. I know we do have people at times who are using DMPS or some other chelating agents, but because I worry so much with so many of the kids with sulfur donors, and that's pretty strong, and it's going to affect a lot of the minerals and some of the other balance. And I know finances are always an issue for everybody. And so rather than have you kind of spin your wheels and go in circles, it might be better to sort of finish that and then kind of start clean and fresh without that as a factor. I would have that depend on whoever you're working with, what they want to see with the DMPS first. Oh, how long to... well, realistically, if you were stopping today and you ordered the bundle of tests tomorrow, it's going to take probably 4 to 8 weeks for all of those tests to come back in and for you to get the samples. And so you don't, you could wait just a couple of weeks to clear the system a little and then run your tests. And by the time they get back, you'll have allowed enough time. But I'd say give it 3 weeks to a month maybe just to clear through the system so that we're not seeing, so that I'm not reacting to test results that are related to DMPS, because then you're not spending your money on the tests and getting the full benefit. And I wouldn't want to see that happen. Yes?
Do you order the tests from your website, and are they a range of like urine, blood, stool? Like what do the tests consist of? How do you gather the data?
You can randomly order a urine toxic or essential, a fecal metal, or a hair test anytime you want. If you want to run some of the other biochemical tests, you would order a comprehensive program review, and what happens is you get 8 of those at one time. So it's a UTM UEE, a fecal metal, a hair metal, a CSA, a GI function, a neurotransmitter, and a MAP test, and I feel like I've forgotten one. UAA, thank you. And eventually we're going to have a global methylation assay related to that too. And then I ask that you give me a 1-page summary of what your biggest concerns are. Or if your doctor's sending it in, he or she can make notes of what their biggest concerns are and fill out our supplement list so I know what that we suggest you're taking or not taking. And it's okay if you're not taking anything, just so I know when I look at it what's going on. And then it takes me probably an hour, maybe 2 hours to go through that entire panel. And I don't charge for my time at all. We just charge for the tests. And I'll make suggestions and recommendations, and then you take that and you go back to your doctor and you implement it.
And do you recommend that the supplements that you're on currently, that you just continue with those, or should you come off of the supplements and do the testing?
If you're on our program and you're using supplements I like to use, stay on them and let me know what you're using. If you're using supplements from another program, chances are I won't like them. And so you might as well just stop them and start clean and fresh. Because what happens is I'm really good-natured and easygoing. And so if I see a list of, let's say you're taking 20, 30, 40 different things. I talked to somebody yesterday whose kid was on 150 supplements, and none of them were from this program. And if I see that, I won't have the heart to make them stop everything at once because they've spent all this money on it. So I'll try to work around it and do the best I can. And what ends up happening is over time, realistically, if you're on 150 supplements, I don't suggest, a year from now you're not going to be on those anymore. And so you might as well just bite the bullet and start fresh and clean on a new slate.
My son's on diflucan and has been for 2 weeks, and iron. So if I were to run this set of tests, would I have to wait, like stop and wait a little while?
Yeah, well, I wait for several weeks off of the diflucan, just because if you're going to run the test, we want to know if yeast is still an issue. You know, I mean, you might as well get feedback to see how effective was the diflucan. So I'd give it a good 3 or 4 weeks so that if it's cropped back up, we know it. And you could send a note in that says he was on diflucans, and one of my issues is concerns about yeast. Iron, I really don't like iron as a supplement. Iron drives bacterial virulence. There's a whole, I don't know, there must be 10 or 15 PowerPoint slides I have proving that every bad bug in the world gets geared up from iron and viruses. And the thing is, he probably has low iron. I don't doubt that. But it could be secondary to some of the things we talked about. And so if you run the tests, the first thing I'm going to say when I see high iron is going to be giving you suggestions to try to pull it down. So I'd give it about a month off of it. Josie, did you have some feedback?
Not a question. I just wanted to clarify for some people, some newcomers, that when you're talking about the lead time, it's not just the lead time of the test that Dr. Amy would look at for you. It's going to be some lead time to get the genomic panel, too. Wouldn't you want that before you do that?
Well, the thing is, Josie brings up a good point. There's the nutrigenomic panel, the genetics test, and then there's also the biochemical tests. People can run the biochemical tests without the nutrigenomics. Is it ideal to have nutrigenomics and the whole biochemical panel? Yes, but the genetic test lead time is a lot longer sometimes. And then if I get a genetic test back and there's anything on there I don't like, I make them rerun it, and so that really increases the lead time. So you could, if you wanted to get started, run the comprehensive panel. In the meantime, run a genetic test if you want, and then it'll, you know, kind of come together. But the other thing is, because these comprehensive panels take so long to do, and I spend, you know, an hour to 2 hours on each one, they're scheduled almost like appointments. And so what you want to do is, like if you just order it, Kelly will you schedule with Kelly from our office a date that you would want it run. And so it's almost as if you have an appointment with me, only you're not sitting there. All of your tests are, which actually gives me more time on the test than having to talk and explain it. So it actually works out quite well. But there is the whole scheduling aspect of it too. Because there may be some, like even if you sent all your tests in tomorrow and they all came back, all of those time slots for comprehensive reviews might already be taken up, and you might end up having to wait a little while to have me review them.
So I still have to make a month for the bank to take it out of the system.
Yes, that's what I would do. Yes. Oftentimes that's ammonia, and I would look at run a UAA. My guess is your taurine's going to be sky high, and maybe he's got a CBS mutation. Would be my initial instinct.
Can you explain again your reservation about the DMPS or DMSA, something about the sulfur content?
Individuals who have CBS mutations have trouble tolerating that, and it makes that whole imbalance in that part of the pathway worse. Also, I tend to be very non-invasive, and so I feel like if we can get there without doing something that's harsher on the system, I'd rather. But I also respect the fact that some people do well with it. And so it's an okay thing to do, but kind of do it as a segment, and then let's move on to this so it's a clean slate.